Alrighty, well, let's get going. I am Brooke Martins. I am one of the co-chairs of the Professional Exam Committee with the AAFMP. And with me today, I have Andy Chandro, who's going to be talking about reforestation. This is one in a number of webinars that we're having to prepare writers for the exam, replacing the all-day Saturday study session that we've had in past years. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. And we're having our last one tomorrow, exams on April 7th, and I do know that we've got some folks with us today that are here for CC credits, because this is an excellent opportunity for that too. So without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to Andy and have him go ahead and talk. If you have any questions, how about, let's say, just type it in the window. If it's really important to ask, then type it in the window now. If not, maybe hold off till the end. Andy will certainly give you some time to ask questions, and we will do that. So we'll deal with the things in the chat window when they come up, as they come up. So here's Andy.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll give you a little bit of information about myself before we get started, just to give myself a little bit of credibility, hopefully. So currently I work with the Government of Alberta as the silviculture specialist for the province, or one of the silviculture specialists for the province. I've worked in the silviculture field for more than 20 years with a variety of contractors and for some sawmills. I've done regen surveys. I've done lots of regen surveys. I've been involved in planting programs. I've been involved in managing stand tending activities and managing scarification and trying to get all that information into the government through ARIS. So I'm certain a lot of you can relate to that. So with that said, I'll get into my presentation. It was originally created by Lee Martins a while ago. I've done some updating and some tweaking to it, but generally the content is very similar. So let's start with an overview of what I'll be talking about today. There's three main topics I want to discuss: reforestation obligation, where it's housed, why you have to do it, talk a little bit about the reforestation standard, and there's some other legislation that works into the system, like the herbicide reference manual. So we'll also talk about other reforestation directives or policies. On your screen, you'll see links to the various documents that we will be presenting today. I've checked those links. They are valid, or still are valid. So if you have any questions after you're done, you can click on those links and it should take you somewhere. All right, in terms of reforestation obligation, typically in the province, if you harvest timber under any type of disposition, you're required to do reforestation. Essentially, we have three major tenure systems in the province. We have the FMA, or the Forest Management Agreement. We have quotas, coniferous and deciduous. And we got permits. We have CTPs, the community timber permits, and the local timber permits. So the reforestation obligation, if you're an FMA holder, is specified within your FMA agreement. And what it says is that you shall reforest at your own expense, or at the company's expense, all the land that was harvested by the FMA holder to the required reforestation standard. The reforestation standard that you'll be upheld to is the standard that's contained within the Timber Management Regulation. And we'll get into that here in a little bit more detail. Quotas. If you're a quota holder and you harvest more than 10,000 cubic meters in a year, then you shall carry out reforestation as well. And that's found in the Timber Management Regulation 142.3. And you can see that's within the document here as well. If you are a quota holder that harvest less than 10,000 cubic meters a year, you may elect to do the reforestation or pay a reforestation levy to FRIA. Permit holders are required to pay a reforestation levy to FRIA. So the community timber programs, some of you are involved in that. That's run by FRIA. And FRIA manages those levies under the FRIA Act. They manage those levies and they do the reforestation. All right. If you're a quota, so I think I've covered this, but I'll go over it again. So if you're a quota holder based on your AAC, you can pay a reforestation levy, or you may have to reforest. If you're an FMA holder, you'll have to carry out the reforestation yourself. Permits. LTPs shall pay a reforestation levy to FRIA. That's specified in timber management regulations, but there are some exceptions. So if you look into the timber management regulations under 142.5, you'll see things like Christmas tree permits. They're not required to pay a reforestation levy. So you go to the district office and you purchase your Christmas tree permit, and that price is the final price that you pay. So part of the reforestation obligation, if you have a disposition, you're required to either pay a levy or do your own reforestation. Reforestation has what's called the 2-year rule. So you're required to do a treatment or a reforestation treatment within 2 years after the end of the year of harvest. That's found in the Timber Management Regulations 141.1. That reforestation might be planting, or it could be a leaf for natural treatment, such as the case for deciduous disposition holders. Sometimes pine disposition holders will have a leaf for natural designation as well. But in the province, there's quite a bit of planting that goes on to meet the 2-year rule. The province does set up some rules governing the source and type of tree seed and vegetation propagules. So if you're aware of the seed zones in Alberta, that's one of the criteria, one of the requirements that companies have to adhere to, is ensuring that seed is collected and planted within a specific seed zone. You're probably also going to be aware, if you're not already, about non-native species and the extent to which they can be planted. So currently, except in trial situations, there are no non-native species being planted in the green zone. You probably are aware of some trials that were involving Siberian larch as an example. And of course, any person that is required to reforest on public land must comply with the rules. So if the rules say that you must collect seed and deploy seed within a specific seed zone or a breeding region, then you must comply with those rules. The Timber Management Regulation also says that disposition holders must submit to the director an establishment survey and a performance survey. Those are the requirements of the Timber Management Regulation. We'll get into those in a little bit more detail. But the establishment survey and the performance survey is a requirement by the Timber Management Regulations. There is a retreatment obligation. So if a company fails an establishment survey, they have 1 year. So before the end of the following year, they must retreat the area by methods and operations approved in writing by the director. So there's a couple ways that can be taken care of. If you do your establishment survey and you find that there's seedlings there that meet some minimum height requirements, you can apply a let it grow designation to it, and that's contained within the Regen Survey Manual. Or you might have to retreat. Maybe there's nothing in the block or the particular opening that you're going to. Maybe you have lots of grass competition, and you may find that you have to do some sort of intervention in a plant. Reporting. So we do require at the government that your reforestation activities are submitted through ARIS by May 15th to the government on any reforestation activities that happened in the preceding year. That doesn't mean that your reforestation surveys or your regen surveys are done on May 12th and then submitted by May 15th. We still have to comply with the timber year, which is the end of April. So all your reforestation is done within a timber year from May 1st to the end of April, and then you have 15 days in which you can report that through ARIS to the government. So how does your reforestation obligation end? I bet you're all wondering. I'm out and I've got these blocks that have been reforested, and I've done maybe some herbicide work or some interventions along the way, and I think I'm done. So your reforestation obligation ends if, in the opinion of the director, the results of the performance survey are acceptable and reforestation is complete and no further reforestation treatments or surveys are required. So generally what that means is you successfully passed a performance survey and you've met your MAI targets, which is one of the criteria of the performance survey. And that's found in the Timber Management Regulation 141.7. The reforestation standards of Alberta, they're enabled, or they're written into the Timber Management Regulation in section 141.2. The purpose of the reforestation standard, and if you're writing the exam, I would probably make a note of these 3 points. The purpose is that they set up the standards and procedures to assess the level of reforestation success. They enable assessment of stocking, survival, and growth. And they assess reforestation performance relative to the strata and the yields assumed in the Forest Management Plan, or the FMP. So in the FMP, some assumptions have been made on future forest growth, and the performance survey tries to make that link. The current big steps on the reforestation standards are: you make your declarations, you do the establishment survey, and of course you have the 2-year treatment rule that you must adhere to. And then you do a performance survey. And if you pass your performance survey, you mosey on your little way and you're complete. The declarations, they set the reforestation objective. And that's, you're assessing the different stratum on an opening by opening level, and you're rolling that up on a year by year basis. So they're linked to the Forest Management Plan, the Timber Supply Analysis, Silviculture Matrix, and Transition. So the Timber Supply Analysis gives you an idea of volume. The Silviculture Matrix, it gives you an idea of the treatments you're going to do to meet your objectives, and also tells you your transitions. And a transition is, if the block you're going to harvest is an AB density white spruce, your transition assumption might be that AB density you're going to plant and reforest to a CD density white spruce. You'll have a stratum target. So the province of Alberta has the minimum base 10 and enhanced forest management stratum as well. So if you're doing tree improvement, you may have stratum for that as well. And the base 10 very generally are broken down into pure species groups and mixed wood types. You also set up a growth target. That's a conifer and D mean annual increment target. And that's based on the stratum, and that's a value in cubic meters per hectare per year. The declarations must be completed by the end of the year following the end of the timber year cut. So that gives you 1 year to set up your declarations and reforest to those declarations. If you've done declarations in the past, there's a little bit of movement, but essentially what we're trying to get is, if you've harvested conifer stands, you're replacing conifer stands in the same amount, relatively the same amount. If you harvested mixed wood stands, you're replacing mixed wood stands in relatively the same amount. And there's different types of mixed woods. There's deciduous leading mixed woods and there's conifer leading mixed woods. Establishment surveys. Establishment surveys determine the reforestation status of each opening to assess species composition and distribution of acceptable trees, and to identify areas and conditions and openings where regeneration success has been inhibited. So that means poorly regenerating areas greater than 4 hectares. Essentially, the establishment survey is a stalking survey. You're going out and you're doing plots. You need to get a minimum 80% stalking in each one of your openings, and you have species composition amounts that you're supposed to get. And that's clearly outlined in the Regen Survey Manual, or the RSA. So that speaks to species composition. So for example, if you're trying to get a conifer stand back, depending if you're in high elevation or lower elevation sites, and I'm using that as a general term, you need 70% conifer or 80% conifer stalking, and a total 80% stalking. Establishment survey timing. No sooner than 4 years and no later than 8 years after the end of the year of cut. I think that rule has been in place for numerous years now. Establishment surveys, I talked about this just briefly previous. You need a total stalking in the opening greater than or equal to 80%. You need to meet your C and D minimum stalking proportions. So like I mentioned before, they're depending on the type of stratum you're trying to get back. If you're trying to get a conifer stratum back, you're looking at a total opening stalking of 80%, but if you're in a lower elevation or higher elevation, you need 70 or 80% stalking. And mixed wood stands require slightly different stalking percentages reflective of the type of stalking or the type of species you're trying to get. So in a DC stand, you need to have at least 50% deciduous. In a CD stand, you need to have at least 60% conifer, and the equivalent species or the opposite species for the D component. The reported, so it's also based on stalking. I mentioned that before. It's stalking based on the presence of acceptable trees. There's a lot that goes into an acceptable tree. An acceptable tree has to meet the species that's defined in the FMP. So in some instances, lodgepole pine is an acceptable species in some FMAs. In other FMAs, it's jack pine. So if you go to Alpac, for example, you'll see jack pine is an acceptable species. But if you're in Warehouse or Grand Prairie area, jack pine is not an acceptable species. It also has to meet some minimum requirements in terms of height. It has to also be healthy. So there's some criteria for acceptable trees. Something that's going to live, essentially something that's going to live. Establishment surveys can take three different types of forms. You can do an intensive grid-based survey. You can do a flyover survey, and you can do a walkthrough survey. The walkthrough and the flyover came about because you can sometimes tell if a block is stalked without having to do a grid-based survey. You can walk into the block and say, wow, this block is thick and full of deciduous, and not have to do very much more than that. And that's the intent of the flyover walkthrough. If you do get to if you do your flyover and walkthrough and you estimate below a certain amount, then you're required to do a grid-based survey. So in the establishment survey, you can consider yourself satisfactorily stocked if you get a minimum 80% stalking and you meet your requirements for conifer and deciduous percentages within the block, and you have no contiguous, poorly stocked areas greater than 4 hectares. And a contiguous, poorly stocked area is a patch, is a big opening with no trees in it that's completely devoid of any kind of vegetation, or devoid of the conifer, the acceptable conifer, acceptable deciduous trees that you're trying to get. If you don't meet those requirements, you become not satisfactorily stocked, and a retreatment is required. And if you remember from about 10 minutes ago, the retreatment has to happen 1 year, within 1 year following that year that the surveys were submitted. Performance surveys. The objective is to assess every opening. So you're not necessarily visiting every opening, but a photo interpreter has looked at all the openings that were cut blocks, and has stratified them, and has classified them to a particular stratum. So they've assessed every opening. Within every opening, you can have a homogeneous unit. So that means you may have sprayed half the block trying to get a CD, or conifer leading mixed wood. When I say CD, it's conifer leading mixed wood. You may have sprayed half the block, and the photo interpreter is going to identify that area if it's there's some requirements there. It has to be greater than 2 hectares. It has to meet a minimum 50-meter width. If it meets those criteria, it becomes its own homogeneous unit within that particular opening. And of course, the unsprayed area, which is the component that companies are likely trying to get deciduous out of, that will become its own homogeneous unit. And within those homogeneous units, some will be selected for sample to get forecast of conifer and deciduous MAI. One of the other things that the performance survey is meant to do is to support efficient data gathering that result in accurate assessment metrics. So that means, what information do we need to collect to be able to predict growth? And to estimate stand and tree parameters to know and have acceptable levels of accuracy. So what that means is, with those two sentences together, you're collecting the minimum information you need to assess growth, but you also have some parameters on quality that says, you know what, if the tree is 5 meters, if you measure it as 10, we're not going to accept that as quality data. The performance survey is required no sooner than 11 years and no later than 14 years after the end of the timber year of cut. Performance survey takes the form of 2 different types. There's the aerial stratification system, which involves air photo acquisition, involves stratification by a photo interpreter, and then selecting homogeneous sample units to go and sample out of. The non-photo system, there's some requirements on that. You may want to read the manual and think about the 250 hectares, less than 250 hectare rule. So the non-photo system isn't meant to be all-encompassing as a large program. It's meant to capture blocks that maybe you missed because the flight was unavailable for a variety of reasons. So you think about Fort McMurray wildfire, there's so much smoke in there, you couldn't capture the photos. But essentially, if you have a sustained yield unit of less than 250 hectares, that's when the non-photo system is meant to be utilized. And you go and you visit the entire block, and the stratification is done through different means. But both systems still use stratification. The field sampling is the same. So whether for the basic and the detailed plot procedures, it's the exact same. The compiler is used in both situations to get you an estimation of MAIs, and you also have to identify poorly regenerated areas. So that's the surveys in a nutshell, in a very brief nutshell. There are some other related documents that go along with silviculture and reforestation. So the Forest Management Herbicide Reference Manual, which is enabled by the Environmental Code of Practice for Pesticides. It allows for some guidelines, or provides guidelines for planning and application of approved herbicides on Crown land. So you're trying to get mixed woods, or you're trying to get pure conifer, Deciduous comes back. In lots of cases, it comes back heavy, and a stand tending treatment is required. I think the stand tending treatment of choice in the province right now is the use of herbicides. And the herbicide reference manual tries to provide some guidance there. Fire salvage planning and operation. Reforestation is required after salvaging fire-killed timber, unless otherwise approved by the minister. What that means, unless otherwise approved by the minister, is a fancy sentence for saying an exemption or a waiver. So there's a whole section that talks about reforestation when doing fire salvage planning. With that, I'll open it up for any kind of questions. You'll see on the screen that there's two people you can contact. Lee Martins, you probably know Lee very well. He works on the Reforestation Manual, which he's trying to make sure it gets out by May 1st. And then, of course, there's me. I'm the new guy. You can definitely send me some of your questions, concerns, or comments.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, so we'll give folks some time to type in some questions. Yeah, if you have to use the audio, I think we can handle one or two. We'll try and manage that. And both Lee and Andrew are really serious about, if you have any questions, they are very willing to answer them. So please don't hesitate to call or email if you have anything exam related or even non-exam related.
Reforestation is the best field by far. I'm just putting my 2 bits in there. Making trees grow is awesome. Okay, we have a question. It says, how much into herbicide am I expected to know? For example, do I need to know when and where arsenal is used as opposed to other herbicides? There isn't a question that specific on herbicides, and I would say that there likely isn't any questions that will pertain to arsenal or glyphosate. For reforestation, you're expected to know what comes into the timber management regulations, in particular the reforestation requirements, performance surveys, establishment surveys, timing of those kind of things. It's a good question.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I think I only saw Craig and Doug typing, and I think both of them have their questions in. So, I mean, Andy and I will be here for another couple of minutes if anybody has any other questions. But I'm going to say, if not, I think we're done.
And feel free to give me a call anytime. Some of you guys on this webinar know who I am. You now got my phone number. So feel free to use it.
Oh, and I do want to reiterate that we have recorded this presentation. We will be making it available to you through the Forestry Commons. I'll probably also post a link on the exam study session or study group on Facebook. It's the only time I ever go on Facebook is to post stuff for the exam. So yeah, we'll try and get that up certainly to Facebook tonight, and we'll see what the office staff can do about getting it on the Forestry Commons tomorrow. It is kind of a busy time of year for them, and Easter's coming up and everything else. But yeah, we want to make sure that you guys have a reference to come back to, and anybody who wasn't able to attend tonight can take a listen to at any time, because reviewing these things is good for anybody for their CC credits. It doesn't necessarily have to be live.
We got an excellent question here. Question was, if the block is greater than or equal to 80% stock, but you have a poorly regenerating area of 4 hectares or greater, would it be considered SR or NSR? That block will be considered NSR. So one of the hard and fast rules is that if you have a not satisfactory stock contiguous patch, so that's another key, it has to be contiguous patch. So if you have accumulations, say you have a 100-hectare block and you got 1 hectare or half a hectare in one part, another half hectare a long ways away, it has to be contiguous, and a 4-hectare patch would be considered NSR. If you want to get into the weeds a little bit, if you do your rolling 5 assessment for the determination of NSR patches greater than 4 hectares, that's what you would do to determine if you have a 4-hectare or greater patch.
Thanks. And I'll take the next question that asked about any more presentations coming up after wildfire tomorrow evening. The answer is no. We will be done for webinars for this upcoming exam because it's less than 2 weeks from now. It is on Saturday, April 7th. There is presentations available for all of the topic areas on the Forestry Commons. So even if we didn't hit it this time around, there's certainly a resource there for you. And, you know, my apologies. These are getting a little close to the exam. That wasn't our intended because Dave last week had his kind of last chance opportunity to ask questions, let you guys know what to expect on exam day kind of thing. That was last week already. So we're kind of beyond that. But we haven't had anything on wildfire in several exams. And, you know, I appreciate Andy's new perspective on this, and hopefully it's helpful. But that said, there is another webinar tomorrow. It's going to start at 4:30. And Stu Kelm is going to be talking about wildfire. There has been some recent changes in the legislation there. So he's going to make sure that that's well covered. Any other questions?